Are you an independent musician feeling overwhelmed by the endless act of juggling creativity, business, and self-care? You're not alone. That's why I created the Artist Mind Map. The Artist Mind Map is a free blueprint designed to help you get clear on the route you need to take to attain your career goals in alignment to your artistic values. This is not just another random PDF page for the forgotten corners of your hard disk. It's a timeless roadmap you can use for decades to come. Think of it as a go-to overview to consult. When you grab your free mind map, you get exclusive access to a masterclass that will take your career to the next level. I use the same methodologies and systems for my high-end paying clients and students. So why am I giving it to you for free? Simple. I want to build a community of artists who can count on each other for safe spaces. Music saved my life. I believe that you have all that it takes to be the artist you were meant to be, if you're willing to put in the work. And more importantly, understanding what that work is. And the Artist Mind Map was designed to help you do exactly that. So if this resonates with you, go to artistmindmap.com and download this resource. artistmindmap.com. Familiarity with a feeling meant to be so sweet. That's the opening line in the song from my upcoming album. In fact, depending on when you hear this, that probably qualified as the first official sneak preview on what is possibly a milestone of sorts in my musical career. But that's a different story. For those of you who came late, we've already skipped some vital small talk at this point, because as you might have guessed, I'm an artist, a professional musician, something that sounds a lot more romantic on the surface than the actual realities involved on the back end, as this episode today will reveal if you keep listening. One of the quirkier blessings of making art for a living was learning how humans spend a lot more time absorbing things before the vocabulary to name all of it exists. This song, like many of its predecessors, knew things about me, my life, my surroundings before I did. I wrote it while visiting my mother a few months ago in a city that comes with a great deal of complexity for me personally, and requires a lot of mindfulness on my part to navigate and keep healed wounds healed. Notice that the song doesn't actually call familiarity itself sweet, but the feeling we think it is. A feeling we tend to associate with a kind of relief we assume will be sweet, as opposed to, say, sour or bitter. It's an assumption that arrives before any actual conscious assessment of the situation involved. And when evaluation does arrive, if at all, it does so later. Which is why today's episode is an invitation to consider having a closer look at this feeling. Welcome to another session solo cast. These solo casts were designed to help independent artists and musicians like you navigate the very complex labyrinth that is your artistic practice and career. They're based on empirical research and experiences of my own career as an independent musician and an educator and coach working with artists just like you. The primary aim behind these sessions is to offer accessibility to the kind of education many of us need to work with in order to forward ourselves in these very confusing times as empowered and independent artists in the truest sense of the word. What the feeling actually tells us, and there's a science behind this, although I should mention at this point, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a somewhat thorough nerd. But the science, as it turns out, backs up my song. Psychologists have apparently known since way back in the late 60s that the simple act of seeing something repeatedly usually suffices to make us prefer it. There are experiments which took this on quite seriously, where meaningless symbols were shown to participants often enough to observe how they eventually started liking them more than symbols they'd seen less often. For those of you new to the show, consider checking out the blog post that comes with this episode. It's linked on the episode notes, and there's a list of references that I include regarding these experiments. Well, anyway, nothing about the symbols improved, by the way, during this experiment. They were just recognizable at some point by the participants. More recent neuroscience describes the brain as a prediction machine rather than a happiness machine. This is referred to as predictive processing, something I refer to as well in some other episodes. So basically, whatever it thinks it can predict feels easier. Whatever feels easier starts to feel true as well. And whatever feels true starts to feel safe. Now, I doubt if we actually need a lab to verify this theory. We've all felt it. The relationship we stayed in a couple of years too long, the job that stopped fitting but kept paying, the city we couldn't leave even after it emptied out for us. Some common examples I'd contend most of us have been through at some point of our lives. And in every case, the feeling said something close to the word home. But what it actually meant was familiar. Familiarity is a record of what we have survived, often dressed up as a promise about what will keep us safe. Now I realize that's a pretty provocative statement to make, but there is actual research documenting this, on how people find guaranteed bad outcomes less stressful than uncertain ones which might reap more benefit down the line. Listen back to that again. Or let me just repeat that. There's actual research documenting how people find guaranteed bad outcomes less stressful than uncertain ones which might reap more benefit. Now, my mum had a saying which she brought me up on. She'd keep saying, known evil is better than unknown evil. Which, in my opinion, is a flawed premise in itself. Because the way I see it, if it's unknown, I'm pretty sure I don't actually reserve the right to label it evil in the first place. You're welcome, Ma, by the way. My mom, along with many other members of my extended family, have been good examples of how a known wound can feel more comfortable than an unknown opening. And I can confirm that the levels of trauma that they've been through qualifies them for a lot of compassion and not just blanket judgment on this. Let's be clear on that. But the physics of it, the dynamics of it, is real. I know, because I've inherited a lot of it and spent a lot more time dealing with the debris than I'm comfortable admitting on some days. The brain will often call this affinity something like prudence. But most of the time, all it really is just, you guessed it, familiarity. I'm going to take this opportunity to share with you today how this has played out in my world. Not just the personal angles involved, some of which I already have shared at this point, but also the industry I work in, one which has been one of the most contentious laboratories for this game, this spiel. Now, the way that spiel affects everyone in ordinary life happens to artists as well. It's not specific to our professions, but the manner in which artists are affected is a bit more amplified and accelerated, often with consequences that are a lot more immediate to sense emotionally, physically, and mentally, which makes it a very useful metaphor to use to see the pattern clearly and then identify what might be a more camouflaged version of it in your own life. Feels like home. There's a word that'll conjure different meanings, different connotations for every one of us. Long creative relationships generate enormous levels of comfort. Why am I saying that? You know how a session or a working relationship with a colleague you've known for a while unfolds. How they take their coffee, where the conversation will and will not go. That comfort reads internally as understanding. But by the time you realize that knowing someone's habits is not the same as being understood by them, the familiarity has already masqueraded as trust for years without us recognizing the deeper patterns underneath. Now, why am I saying this? I'm in the middle of negotiating what is possibly one of the most important collaborations of my life, at the risk of sounding slightly dramatic. And the trickiest part of it all has not been the paperwork. We haven't even gotten there yet. It's been watching my own system reach and almost settle for older arrangements because they were easier to identify with. The familiar dynamic, the silence around questions that could have been asked decades ago, the knee-jerk urge to manage emotions that are my responsibility. They're not my responsibility. The reflex to conflate compassion with enablement. None of that familiarity is necessarily evidence of the fairness many of us strive to be a beacon of, but end up displaying as an act of endurance instead. Endurance of conditions that were actually relatively simple problems to be solved. And for those of you who've known my work longer, you might know that I'm actually not the biggest proponent of problem solving as the ultimate problem solver. It's often sold to be. So know that I've contemplated this hard before putting it down on paper and on tape. So either way, pardon the presumption here, but I'd guess that you have a version of this too, because everybody does. A friendship running on memory rather than presence. There's another word doing the rounds these days. A business partner you stopped being truly honest with somewhere around year 3. A family role you feel pressured to perform because the script is so well rehearsed that going off, it feels like betrayal. The question is the same in every case. Is this really who I am? Or clothes I'm wearing? Clothes I'm comfortable wearing? Some stories think for us without necessarily us consenting. The music industry, for example, runs on an old bedtime story. Get discovered, get signed, get taken care of. That story is so well worn that despite the ever-increasing atrocities that not just get normalized but defensible amidst the numbness, only the brave few seem willing to examine it, while generations of artists keep signing their ownership and agency away, quite nonchalant to the way their passions continue to get exploited for the profit of a third party. The legacy of our own work threatens to get lost amidst the noise, amidst all the fear, while the dream continues to feel too familiar to question. The systems that did the damage were never hidden. They were sitting and continue to do so in plain sight, wearing shapes everyone recognizes. Familiarity continues the negotiation, and artists, creators, keep paying for it. The universal version of this is, in my opinion, any inherited script we hesitate to put on the table and take a long, hard look at. Buy a house. Get a job. Take the promotion. Pray you won't be the one who got fired. Stay near the family. Don't make a fuss. Don't be too complicated. Don't ask too many questions. and so on and so forth. Now, none of these stories are necessarily wrong, but there's just one problem with them. They're unexamined. And a story unexamined is not a choice. It's a default. Defaults are written by those who get there before us. The familiar path often feels safer because there are footprints you can see. And not a lot of us take a moment to actually think about the fact that these footprints are not ours. Suffering as a costume. There's another word that can get some very interesting responses from us. With my old, somewhat Eastern influenced quasi-Buddhist background, it's a word I've been acquainted with for a while, often in context to philosophies which consider suffering as an inherent part of the human condition. Now, this is open to debate and probably not within the scope of what I'm trying to address here. But what I would want to address is how suffering often comes as a costume. Here's an example. One of the traps I watch a lot of peers, collaborators, even clients, but then if they're a client, they're already trying to break the pattern because they want to work on cracking the code. But one of the traps I see so many, let's just say, members of the creator industry, or even outside, one that took me the longest time to see in myself, by the way, is the whole being broke or being poor collapsed with authenticity. The first time I thought about it, it hurt. I was like, ouch. It really hurt to see myself in that stereotype. But the starving artist has centuries of mythology behind it. That mythology comes with a kind of familiarity that almost manages to qualify it as an inherent destiny. A home for some of the most brilliant minds and hearts I've had the privilege and heartbreak to have made the acquaintance of. Meanwhile, those who choose to investigate the validity of this theory by educating themselves in topics like business, psychology, economics, sociology, value, will often run the risk of having their endeavors labeled as some form of contamination, a betrayal of real art. And as you might have guessed by now, the reality, in my opinion, is not just far from it, but an actual opposite. I challenge anyone listening to this to find anything that erodes creative freedom faster than precarity. Try saying no to the worst offer you've ever received in your life when rent has been due longer than you can even bear thinking about. The struggling artist does not have more authenticity, just less artistic freedom. Now, feel free to replace struggling artist with struggling entrepreneur or creator. Either way, the struggle, quote-unquote struggle, is one of the most familiar spaces to be in, to a point where exiting it feels scarier than remaining there for the rest of our life. We become that bird who failed to find the courage, let alone the capacity, to visualize a freedom that might come with the act of flying out the door, even if opened, despite the gift of all the ability to do so the whole time. Embracing that identity, by the way, will eventually feel like the easier thing to do, as the suffering now starts becoming a normal part of how we describe ourselves. The overworked one, the unlucky one, the talent that never got discovered, the one who never catches a break. Pain gone unexamined so long that it stops being an experience and morphs into something we become instead. And once we're at that state, we will be ready to defend it till the very bitter end. Because now, letting go feels like losing ourself, not the pain. Most of the decisions that have actually changed my life for the better felt not just petrifying, but wrong at the time I took them. Leaving secure structures, moving countries, walking away from rooms I'd spent decades earning my place in. building a business as an extension of an artistic career when the culture around me treated the word business as a confession. None of it felt safe, and some pretty absurd at the time. And every one of those decisions had the one thing in common that so many of us strive every day to avoid: uncertainty, lesser known as unfamiliarity. Each of these steps were filed under the same category by my nervous system: danger. And there's a very distilled lesson I've learned in that. And what it really cost me, that lesson, was never really the safety I was worried about losing, but some willingness to take curiosity to the deepest level to apply. Because the thing is, growing, expanding, never arrives feeling familiar. That's the whole point. And the feelings we use to evaluate our choices are more often than not biased against the ones that would actually bring the change the depths of our being yearn for. Parting thoughts. In my episode, Confirmation Bias and the Law of Attraction, I talked about verified scientific evidence. Again, not a scientist, just a nerd. However, I do refer to scientific literature on how entire functions of our brain revolve around seeking evidence to confirm exactly that, what we believe within our physical environment. This is pretty much the basis of what eventually went on to establish one of pop culture's biggest and most questionable movements, the law of attraction. Now, regardless of what brand of woo science or art one prefers to lean towards, the reality of our respective journeys and its correlations with what feels comfortable to us, while not really up for debate anymore at this point, because the evidence is out there, the research is out there, still provide ample impetus for the kind of investigation the events of the world around us not just invite, but now push us to investigate. Familiarity with a feeling meant to be so sweet. Sweet is indeed a matter of taste. And that which the tip of our tongue chooses to come in contact with, and the role we play in it, in both directions. That intake, output. Talk about coming out wrong. You get that one? Anyways, but that entire dynamic now comes with a responsibility that's not just about a thriving versus surviving thought experiment anymore. It's a question every single one of us will want to gain a brand of authentic, there I said it, authentic familiarity with. Because our relationship with the planet is a precious one during the time we have with it together. And that time is finite and fragile. And that finite and fragile nature makes itself apparent in ways which are impossible to ignore at this point and are possibly unprecedented in history. Hope that helps. Hey folks, I hope you found that episode helpful. Here's a little request. If you did, consider sharing this episode with your folks. Think about the ways in which they might benefit the way you did. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have queries. My name's TL. I'm an independent musician and educator and the founder of the Holistic Musician Academy.